Great. All right, I think the way we'll do this, we'll take two questions at a time. If you could state your name and affiliation. We'll start with the fellow in the back here, and then the woman in the dress.
Thank you. Matt Duss, Center for American Progress. Michael, going to your point about George Kennan, which I think was a good one, and his article, and in as much as it gets to what we haven't really seen a consensus form in the U.S. foreign policy establishment about the nature of the Iranian regime. Not only will they or won't they or do they or don't they want a deal, but what is their vision of Iran's place in the region and in the world? Do they fundamentally want to overturn the U.S.-led world order, or are they trying to find their own proper and respectable place within that order? Now, I think, Trita, you've written pretty convincingly that they have, even though it's an ideological regime, they have fairly realist views about what they want to achieve, defense and security for their own regime, and hegemony and influence, as all countries want. Michael, I wonder if you could just share your view on that.
Okay, we'll go right into the questions. It's a long question, so we'll go to the answer.
Sure, and I can answer quickly. I personally, and people argue this, think that the Iranian regime is very much focused on Iran. I don't think they have a vision for a new world order, at least not pragmatically, one that they're seeking to implement. I do think they're not a status quo power in the sense that many other Middle Eastern countries are, and that's one of the reasons they have difficult relations with Middle Eastern countries. But I do think that there's something very good that our friend Karim Sajjadpour wrote about reading Khamenei, and he sort of lays out the principles that have guided the Iranian regime. And it is clear that they are not necessarily interested in being a part of that world order that you're talking about. So I don't know that it's either of the options you put forward. I think they value self-sufficiency very much, which is why they rejected this idea of the China model of economic reform and opening, but political stability, as it were, refusing to reform politically. I think they value self-sufficiency. I think they value these pillars of the regime of the Islamic Republic that were set up by Ayatollah Khomeini. So while focused on Iran, I don't think they're interested in being part of a broader order or being part of a broader system.
Thank you. My name is Ladan Nukumaram, and I'm with Radio Free Europe. I just had a question on the sanctions. Can you talk about how the sanctions are going to affect the Iranian people? Because there's been a lot of reports saying that it'll actually hurt the people, and you had suggested that there should be a new wave of sanctions, whereas students who are here, who have parents who send them money, they might not be able to get that, or students who want to go abroad, or just, the economy in general. How is that going to affect the people?
Can I take the first one? Thank you for that question. I think that's a very, very important question, particularly since it has been an explicit objective of the countries imposing the sanctions not to hurt the Iranian people. So one can compare the track record towards that objective. And I think just a couple of weeks into the latest phase of the sanctions, I think it's quite clear that that doesn't necessarily seem to hold up quite well. Some of the first victims of the sanctions were the very same students who were out on the streets last year trying to make a difference for their country, trying to make sure that they get proper representation, their own values for democracy, human rights. And unfortunately, due to the very, very massive repression that has now increased in Iran, one of the few ways for an Iranian young person to be able to get out of the country is to get accepted into a university abroad. As one of the very, very few channels that they currently have available to themselves. Unfortunately, as a direct result of the sanctions, the company who was giving the TOEFL tests and other tests decided to withdraw and not give those tests to Iranian nationals any longer. That was changed about 2 weeks later through some intervention. But there are other companies who have not been written about in the New York Times, who have continued and have actually made it much more difficult than it was in the past. In the past, Iranian students have told me that you could go to Dubai, and as long as you could show a Dubai address, you could give a test. Now they're required to see your passport. If your passport is an Iranian passport, you will not be able to give that test. Now, even if some of these things can get fixed, it does show how sanctions, particularly when one cannot make the argument that sufficient efforts were put in to make sure that they weren't more targeted, how they actually do affect the larger population. There were opportunities on the Hill to, for instance, make sure that the sanctions were coupled with efforts to make it easier for American and Iranian NGOs to work together, to lift some of the sanctions on internet and other type of exchanges. Unfortunately, those efforts were not included in the final sanctions bill. Now, how will that affect the population in Iran in the sense of their view of the government and their view of their ability to put pressure on the government? One of the contradictions of sanctions is that they actually tend to be far more successful and effective when they're imposed on democratic governments. Because in democratic countries, the population have an ability to affect the policies of their governments. And as a result, pressure on the population can lead to pressure on the government to change its ways. But when you're dealing with non-democratic governments, a government that in the last year alone has shown a tremendous willingness to completely disregard the views and the wishes of a very, very large section of their own population, you have a much more limited ability to do so. And the sanctions in the last 10 to 20 years have so far not managed to result in that type of a popular pressure on the government to change its ways. I have very little faith that they will be able to do so in the future either. It also has something to do with the psychology of the population that is under pressure, that is under sanction. I think it is valuable to take a look at what happened in 2007 when the Ahmadinejad government rather rapidly and without much forewarning put into place a rationing system for gasoline. Which meant that a lot of people in Iran who were moonlighting as cab drivers, which includes a lot of people in Iran, including university professors and others, because of the very dire economic situation there, suddenly had much of their income taken away from them, and they had to ration how much gasoline they could buy. It led to 2.5 days of protests and riots. I've seen different figures saying between 1,000 to 10,000 people participating in those riots. Compare that to what happened on the Monday after the June 12th elections in Iran, when 3 million people took to the streets, protests that lasted at least till December of that year. It shows what people react to. Added economic pressure for a population that already for 30 years have endured war and endured economic sanctions does not seem to be the thing that gets people out on the streets or to put the pressure on the government to change its policies. But that sense of lost hope, that sense of having been deprived of something that was their right, caused them to react in a way that very few people, myself included, expected. It tells you something on what pressure actually can and cannot achieve, in my opinion.